All right, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back to the Dharma Doors. I'm MC Owens, and this is the San Francisco Dharma Collective. Uh, Tonight, we're going to read another sutta. That's right. Uh, so, we are still in the Middle Length Discourses. We're moving on to Sutta number 102 tonight. But really quickly before I start, um, everybody here knows already, but I'm going to mention it now because I think I'm going to forget at the end. So this is more for posterity, for the video to live online. But I just want to remind everybody that I'm going to be, well, two things actually. One, we are in the process of publishing a new series of sutra translations, and this is the first. So this is the Vajra Prajna Paramita Sutra. And to commemorate the occasion, I'm going to be offering a course on the Vajra Sutra starting in a couple of weeks. So at the end of September on Tuesday nights. If you join the course, you will get a free copy of the sutra. That's the only way this is available at the current moment, by the way. And so if you want to join that, you can go to lotusunderground.com and register there. Also, very quickly, I want to remind everybody that my historical fiction novel, A Sacrifice of Monks, is also now available on my website, lotusunderground.com. So if you want to read this, you can get a copy there. And that's all the updates. So again, I know all of you already sort of knew that, and some of you have already signed up. So thank you for that. But tonight, let's dive into the Majjhima Nikāya. So tonight's sutra is an exciting one. I really like this sutra. So tonight's sutra is called the Pañcattaya Sutta, the 5 and 3. And this sutra is really interesting because what it is it's kind of a shorter, more concise version of the very first sutra of the Digha Nikāya. So this is, of course, the long discourses of the Buddha. This is like the Digha Nikāya. And these, of course, are considered to be, the very important suttas. And the very, very first sutta in this collection is called the Brahmajala Sutta. So Brahmajala is Brahma's net. Now, these translators, they call this sutra what the teaching is not, which is a very appropriate title, but it's not exactly what Brahmajala means. Brahmajala is again the net of Brahma, the net of God in that way. And this sutra, it also goes by the name The 62 Erroneous Views. I'm excited tonight because forever I've really enjoyed teaching this sutra, the Brahmajala Sutta. I think it's like so important for understanding what the teaching is not. Well, for understanding Buddhism. But I was excited to find that Sutta number 102 that we're going to get into tonight is seemingly a kind of simpler, shorter, I think more accessible version of the same teaching. So I'm excited to share that with you tonight. So that's the first thing to note, that this sutta kind of has another longer version. The other thing that we want to note, or that I want to make kind of mention ahead of time, we've been doing a good job of basically studying a sutta every Sunday night. And I've been happy about that because, these are like, as I've been calling them, they're these like mind adventures. And you don't really get the whole adventure if, you don't go all the way to the end, right? So I've been really wanting to give everybody the adventure. Tonight, though, this is such a technical sutra. There's a lot of really important ideas. So I'm not going to be in a rush to get through the whole sutta tonight. It has a magic of its own. Like it is very much a sutta that you would want to cover in a whole, a whole session. So we're going to see how it goes. So I'm just letting everybody know this might be a two-parter, might be a three-parter. It might be a 5 and 3. Who knows? I don't know. So I want to take it really slow. Again, these are ideas that, first of all, they're really important, but also, when I was teaching up in San Francisco in person, we did the Brahmajala Sutta, and I remember spending a lot of time on it, but that was years ago now. So we haven't really talked about these ideas for a while. So I'm excited to dive back in. Okay, so that's the second piece of information, is that this might be a two-parter or a three-parter. We'll find out. Next up, and let's see, we might be able to just dive in. Yeah, let's just dive in and then we'll see. So, really quickly, the Majjhima Nikāya, of course, is about 150 suttas, 150 teachings of the Buddha. They're broken into the first 50, the middle 50, and the last 50. And we are now officially in the last 50. And all 150 suttas are grouped in groupings of 10. And those 10 suttas usually have like a theme, a connective, something that ties them all together. This section doesn't quite seem to have a theme yet. We've only done one of them, the Devadaha Sutta. Devadaha was just the name of the place where the Buddha gave the teaching. There's one thing I've noticed. The last sutta that we did 2 weeks ago, the first of this section, and this sutta tonight, unlike a lot of the other suttas that we've studied from this collection, this sutta, like last week's, it's kind of the Buddha just telling the bhikshus like what he thinks. Nobody asked him, it was unprompted in that way. So that's the only thing I've noticed so far, is that these are unsolicited teachings of the Buddha in that way. So, but as we go through it, both, tonight and in the future, let's see if we can identify what connects these 10 suttas. So let's dive in to the Pañcattaya Sutta, the 5 and 3, and the title will make sense in a little bit, so just hold on to that. But it goes a little something like this. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. There he addressed the bhikkhus. Bhikkhus! Venerable Sir, they replied. And the Blessed One said this. Bhikkhus, there are some recluses and Brahmins, there's some Shramanas and Brahmanyas who speculate about the future and hold views about the future, who assert various doctrinal propositions concerning the future. Okay, so now I can tell you what the sutta is about. So the Buddha, and again, this is exactly what Sutta number 1 of the Digha Nikāya is about. The Buddha in both suttas is talking about the belief systems of these other recluses and Brahmins, Shramanas and Brahmanyas. All right. So specifically what we are talking about, this is our first technical term of the night, We are talking about a ditthi, or in Sanskrit, a drishti, a view. I often like to point out, in English, we use this language of a point of view, or a worldview, or a religious view, or a political view. We use in English this language of a view. And normally, a view, of course, is like, like, wow, that's a nice view. You can see all the way to the ocean, right? Well, the word drishti or ditthi in Pali, it literally means a gaze or a view, like literally to look at with your eyes. But just like in English, what we're really talking about is a worldview. If you're not super familiar with this concept of a worldview, what the sutta tonight and the first sutta of the Digha Nikāya, it's about all of these different worldviews. And a worldview is about where all of this came from, like the universe and you and everybody else. Like, where did all of this come from? Was it made by God? Is it uh, an accident, a biochemical electrical accident? How did we actually get here? That's part of a view. That's part of a worldview. We might also, by the way, call this a cosmology. So part of a cosmology or part of a drishti, part of a view, is where all of this came from. Another big part of having a view is where all of this is going. And I want to remind you tonight, we are always kind of talking simultaneously about the world or the universe or the cosmos. You can get as big as you would like. Multiverse, anybody? We're talking about the world, and we're talking about you, the subject. So we're talking about where the world came from, but also where you came from. And a worldview is about where the world's headed and where you're headed. Meaning, like, after you die, what happens? And another part of a worldview is about now, meaning, what am I supposed to do? And this is where ideas of maybe morality or duty, responsibility, but it's all about a cosmology has to do with the present moment as well, which is what is the meaning of all of this being here now? And what is the meaning of me being here now? So that's a worldview, that's a cosmology. And the most important thing going into the teaching tonight is we want to remember, oh, right, if I believe that God created the world and this is all going to, in a way, kind of collapse back into God, and therefore what I am to do now is have a relationship with God or something, that's a worldview. That's a cosmology. But if I think, no, there's no God, it's just a bunch of atoms and molecules and particles that used to be, I guess, the size of a marble, as they say, and then it all exploded. And now here we are as part of some sort of like fortunate accident. And it's all going to collapse back into a point the size of a marble again. No God, no creator, no morality. That too is a worldview. So I don't want anybody thinking that a worldview is only about ideas of God and a creator. No, it could be that you don't believe in a creator. Okay, so that's the topic tonight. is a drishti. Also, a reminder, if this is a topic that you're like really interested in, then Sutta number 1 of the Digha Nikāya gives all 62 possible worldviews that seemingly were sort of popular at the time of the Buddha. That there were actually 62 competing opinions on where this all came from and where it's all going. So if you want all 62, read the full version. This one, again, is an abbreviated version. I forget exactly how many worldviews it presents. If anybody wants to count, feel free. But okay, so that's the first thing. The Buddha is talking about some recluses and Brahmins who have a drishti. But now we want to notice a couple of some verbiage. The Buddha is talking about some of these other, religious teachers or spiritual teachers, these other Shramanyas and Brahmanyas, and he's saying that some of them speculate about a view concerning the future. They hold certain views concerning the future, and they assert views concerning the future. So there's 3 kind of things going on there in terms of like speculating about stuff, clinging or holding it, and then trying to get other people to agree with it. All right. So the Buddha is saying that some Shramanyas and Brahmanyas have worldviews that they speculate about, hold on to, and promote. And the Buddha is going to start by talking about views pertaining to the future. This is a little, people comment that this is a little out of order in the Brahmajala Sutta, number 1. The Buddha does past, present, and future. It's very kind of, I believe he does, well, I know he does past first, but I believe he does present, then future. Here it's a little different, but doesn't really matter. So the first thing is the Buddha is going to give 5 possible views regarding the self after death. These, and nobody get confused, these are not the Buddhist views. Remember, the Buddha is talking about other Shramanyas and Brahmanyas. So these are those 5 views that other teachers speculate about. Number 1, some assert this: the self is percipient and unimpaired after death. The language is going to repeat itself, so let's get the language clear from the beginning. So they're speculating, they're talking about what happens after you die. And one view is that the self has samnya, has perception, is perceiving things. So that's the language of percipient. It's like technical philosophical speech, but they're just talking about being perceptive, having perception. This is going to be the second technical term of the night, samnya. So some people say that the self has samnya, so there's perception of something, and that the self after death is unimpaired. Okay. My understanding of what they're talking about, and that's going to be the only time I'm going to, qualify this as my understanding, but my understanding of what they're talking about, which is, it's pretty standard. This is not a radical interpretation of this, but they're talking about a kind of what you might call a soul or an essence, but in our modern, at least Western imagination, we have the like the visual of like a ghost. The West, or at least English, we lack a lot of, developed vocabulary around these things, right? So like we have the image of like a ghost, right? So that after you die, like a spirit comes out. Well, a lot of people have had this view for a very long time. So the first speculative drishti is that after you die, whatever that is that pops out, it can perceive things. And let's say right before you died, you were ill, you were sick, I don't know, maybe you got hit by a car and you were bleeding all over the place. You would be very impaired, right? You would be feeling pretty bad. But this speculative view says that once that soul you, essence you, has died, it's not, it's healthy. Is the actual language is that it's healthy, unimpaired. And I think that even in our limited kind of Western Judeo-Christian imagination, we have this idea, right? That after death, there's like freedom and release, and there's no more pain. That's what they're talking about. So they're talking about an idea of a self. Oh, and by the way, everybody out there that's like really thinking, in the translation here, when it says, the Buddha says, yes, some people assert the self is percipient and unimpaired after death. Don't read too much into the language of the self. What I mean is that the original, the Pali, the language, the original text, it's more general. They're not actually, the Buddha or whatever, they're not asserting an Atman, a Pudgala. You know, I know you probably know a lot of the technical language in Buddhism for a self. This is actually just using the language of, it would maybe be better translated as, some assert that one is percipient and unimpaired after death. So in English, we use like that use of the, like, one would, is unimpaired. And we're kind of avoiding technical language of a self, individual, soul, or essence by just saying one. Take it for whatever that means. Okay, so I want everybody to be clear about that. So the language in the translation, yeah, because even in the alternate translation of Bhikkhu Sujato, he uses self, but don't read too much into that. And the first option is that after death, you are aware of things, you are perceiving things, and you're feeling good, you're unimpaired. Number two, some other Shramanyas and Brahmanyas, they assert that the self is non-percipient, is asamya, no samya, but is unimpaired after death. So this would be the idea. And by the way, we kind of need to keep in mind that there's a default mode understanding of reincarnation going on here. Like that's the default presumption, is that there's birth, death, and rebirth, birth, death, and rebirth. There's other options, but the default presumption is that there's just going to be rebirth. And so what they're saying is that one option is that while you're on your way to that rebirth, you're aware of things, you are percipient, and you're feeling good, you're unimpaired. The other option, though, is that you are basically unconscious. So you die, you are not aware. And then you come into awareness in your new body. So, but after death, you are non-percipient, you are not aware, no samnya, but you are definitely unimpaired. The third option, he says, is, well, some other people assert that the self is neither percipient nor non-percipient and unimpaired after death. Now, I know that that sounds like our classic neither with perception nor non-perception of Buddhism, but the commentary tradition is that that is not as what is being spoken about here. The commentarial tradition says they are talking about people that assert that after death, what's going on mentally can't be called perception, but it can't be called like unconscious or blacked out because there's something going on there. But it's just not samnya or not samnya. So the commentarial tradition is that they're asserting some other kind of mental activity going on, but just like number one and number two, the self is unimpaired. All right, everybody okay with those three? By the way, the Buddha's going to just roll all of those up into one in a moment. Okay, so those are the first three options. Behind door number 4, some other Shramanyas and Brahmanyas, they assert, or sorry, they describe, or they describe the total annihilation, destruction, and extermination of an existing being at death. This, of course, would be what we modern people would call either materialism, a certain form of nihilism, or what is classically called in Buddhist literature, annihilationism. The basic idea, and some of you out there might hold this view, but it's the idea that once the body is on the funeral pyre and after it has been cremated and it's gone, that's it. Gonzo, dunzo. That's that worldview. Okay. And then, and this is going to be one of the trickiest ones. It's not actually that tricky. It's actually the whole point of the sutta. But at the beginning, it's a little tricky. The fifth possible drishti concerning the future is that some Shramanyas and Brahmanyas, they assert nirvana now. Nirvana here and now. Now, the Buddha's not going to get back to this one for a while. Basically, this is one of those situations where I hadn't encountered this sutra before. Like before 2 weeks ago, I didn't know this sutra existed. When I first cracked it open after the end of last Dharma Doors or 2 weeks ago Dharma Doors, when I got to that section where I was like, okay, these are 5 erroneous views concerning the future. And number 5 is the people that assert nirvana here and now. But that is being called a wrong view. So immediately I was thinking, oh, they're talking about maybe the Jain idea of nirvana, because the Jain tradition, they use the word nirvana. But basically, and this is where, because I don't think we're going to get through the whole sutta tonight, I will just tell you where this goes. The interesting thing about that is he's actually talking about the type of nirvana where somebody would claim to have achieved it. And all of a sudden, that makes sense as a view of the future because it's the idea of a residual clinging to an idea of self, the self that achieved nirvana. And it's the idea that I'm gonna be that nirvana self tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. And the Buddha's gonna call that the wrong understanding of nirvana. I don't know if we'll get there tonight, but I just didn't want anybody wondering, wait, what's up with the fifth wrong view? That's the idea. Okay, so those are the 5 drishtis concerning the future. We're just getting started, but any questions about those? Do those make sense? You obviously you don't have to agree with them. I would advise you not to agree with them, but okay. Also, by the way, I always like to remind everybody a sutra like this is probably definitely 2,500 years old or so, because these, of course, date back to the time of the Buddha. I want us to notice that over the last 2,500 years, the jury is still out. Is it just after this all decomposes, it's over? Is there something more? What's it like after that? Are you aware? Are you not aware? Well, 2,500 years later, we are still debating, but we needn't debate if we know what the Buddha is talking about. Okay, to summarize, thus, the Buddha says, thus they, meaning those Shramanyas and Brahmanyas, they either describe an existing self that is unimpaired after death, or they describe the annihilation, destruction, and complete extermination of an existing being after death. Or, third option, they assert nirvana here and now. Thus, he says, these views, these drishtis, being 5, actually become 3. And being 3, they become 5. And this is the summary of the 5 and the 3. Everybody catch the 5 and the 3? So we started with our 5, but he said those first 3 are all saying the same thing. They're saying there's a self after death, and it's feeling good, it's unimpaired. There's just a little question about the degree of cognition. Is it aware? Is it not aware? Or is it subtly aware, as the commentarial tradition says? But they're all the same thing. So you either believe in an afterlife, or you're an annihilationist, or you have this nirvana here and now idea. Okay, so that's how the Buddha turns the 5 into the 3. And then in section 3, he goes on to say, therein, bhikkhus, those recluses and Brahmins who describe the self as percipient, as aware, as perceiving, and unimpaired after death, describe such a self. Percipient and unimpaired after death, they describe that percipient, unimpaired self after death. They describe it as either being of material form, so of rupa, not of material form, arupa, or both material form and immaterial form, or neither material form nor immaterial form. They also describe that self after death as being percipient of unity, percipient of diversity, or percipient of the limited, or percipient of the immeasurable. Or else, among those few who go beyond even that, some make assertions about the vijnana kashina, the consciousness kashina, which is immeasurable and imperturbable. Okay, So we've got this self thing going on after death, and it is percipient, it's aware, right? It's unimpaired. But what's the nature of that you, that self, that thing after death? What is it made out of? Like, what's its nature? Option number one is that it is made out of material form. That would mean that you could put it on a scale and measure it, right? This is the is it that what would you call it? That urban folklore about the 21 grams. It's a folklore about that when a person dies, they measure a 21-gram difference after they've died, and people speculate, oh, that means the soul actually weighs 21 grams. There's a movie called 21 Grams, I believe. I don't actually think that's true at all, or at least it hasn't been actually measured. But that idea that the soul, you could put it on a scale and it would actually weigh something. And a person dying like loses that weight. That would indicate that the soul is made out of something. It's rupa, it's made of form. So our worldviews are getting complicated because now you could be the type of person that believes in a perceiving, unimpaired self after death, but that self is made out of something. Again, it might be very fine, but it is made out of something. That's option number one. Option number two, though, is that it's arupa, that it's formless, that it's you couldn't weigh it on a scale. If this is like confusing to you, it shouldn't be, because in the world of Buddhism, the first aggregate, the first aggregate of the body is form, is rupa. But the next four, sensation, perception, conditioning, and consciousness, those are arupa. They're formless. Consciousness doesn't have a color. Consciousness discerns different colors, but it is not a color. Consciousness is what discerns things, but it itself is not a thing, is the idea. So in Buddhism, there's already the distinction between the material world or the world of form and the world of the mind, which is immaterial. So now it shouldn't be that surprising that they're suggesting that one possible nature of the self after death is that it's made of something, but the other option is that it's just like consciousness. It's just like the mind. It's not a thing. It's immaterial. That's an option. Option number three is that it is both material and non-material. And if you're wondering, well, how could that be? You're non-material and material is the idea. That's what they call the mind-body problem in Western philosophy. So early Buddhism, and I always want to remind everybody, we're studying the early Buddhist tradition on Sunday nights these days. And in the early Buddhist tradition, they have a mind-body problem because part of this is physical and part of it is non-physical. So it could be that that self that is aware and unimpaired after death, it could be that it's not too unlike you are right now, partially made of form, partially not made of form. There's another option, though, which is that it's neither made of form nor non-form. The commentarial tradition says this is just saying it's possible that there's something we don't know about. And that's the nature of the self after death. Some other thing. Okay, so there's that. By the way, those ideas of being of rupa, not rupa, rupa and not rupa, and neither rupa nor not rupa, that fourfold structure is going to carry over to the next section and the next section and the next section. So, but because we are talking about a self that is percipient, is aware, it has samya, we need to talk about the possible ways that the percipient, unimpaired self after death is percipient. And one option is that, and this is the translation of this version, one option is that it's percipient of unity versus the next one, which is percipient or aware of diversity. I know this is going to sound weird at first, but it's not that weird. What they're talking about, let's do the second one. Let's do that one first. To be aware or percipient of diversity is to be aware of sounds and smells and visual forms and tastes and resistance. In other words, it's a diversified sensual field where there's a mixture of sensual input. So one option is that the percipient unimpaired self after death has diverse, different kinds of awareness or samya or perception, versus the type of perception that you cultivate in a meditative state that is single-minded and focused, and it is not diversified, it's concentrated. It is, my best example would be, as usual, like a dream. A dream, for lack of a better term, is monolithic. It's one sensory situation going on, right? Well, meditative states can also be one sensory input in that way. So that would be a percipient unimpaired self after death that is just having a monolithic sensory experience versus one that's having a diversified sensory experience. And then the last two are percipient of the limited versus percipient of the immeasurable. Percipient of the limited is basically code, it's Buddhist code for a mind that is in one of the jhanas. And it's a limited jhana, a limited one, because, well, basically because there is still like subject-object situation going on in the realm of form. So the perception is of limited objects by a limited self, whereas percipient of the immeasurable is the Buddhist code language for the first formless jhana, the base of infinite space. So one option is that a percipient unimpaired self after death, it's similar to being in the realm of empty space. It is an immeasurable realm without subject or object. That's one option. The other option is the limited. It's percipient of the limited, so it's like a liberated mind that's in a jhana. And then, after those 8 possibilities, and I read this the first time, but the Buddha goes on and says, or else, among those few who go beyond even that, some Shramanya and Brahmanyas, they make assertions about the consciousness kashina, which is immeasurable and imperturbable. This is actually a really, really interesting line, because what it is doing is equating the second formless jhana, which is usually called the base, the ayatana, the base of infinite consciousness, right? The vijnana ayatana. But interestingly, this text calls that same thing the consciousness kashina. And a kashina is normally an external meditative object, like a colored disc or like a bowl of water or a fire pit. Like those would be a kashina traditionally. So it's interesting that they're calling the second formless jhana, the plane or the base of infinite consciousness, they're calling it a kashina. That's a little clue. Okay. So those are regarding the first possibility, right? Because there were 5 possibilities, and the first one is a percipient, unimpaired self after death. But there's 9 possibilities for that. This is turning into quite a matrix here. So everybody keeping up? Yeah, no.
Yeah, I was thinking we need a chart.
Yeah.
I need a chart. Thank you for
I have a little chart, but
you do.
I'm
Okay.
trying to keep us on track. So, yeah. Okay. So that's the first part. Oh, no, we're not quite done, but this is going to be the first moment, and this is going to happen like 4, 5, maybe 6 or 7 times in the sutta. So this is the first time it's going to happen. After describing what some other people, some Shramanyas and Brahmanyas think, the Buddha is now going to say, but let me tell you about what I'm teaching, right? So this is like the important part. So the Buddha is now speaking to the bhikkhus saying, the Tathagata, the thus come one, bhikkhus, understands this way. Those good recluses and Brahmins who describe the self as percipient and unimpaired after death describe such a self to be either material or immaterial, or both material and immaterial, or neither material nor immaterial, percipient of unity, percipient of diversity, percipient of the limited, or percipient of the immeasurable. Or else, some of them make assertions about the base of infinite nothingness, immeasurable and imperturbable. For them, they say there is nothing, meaning we've reached a point where there is nothing, absolute emptiness, or not the good emptiness, but absolute non-nothingness. So for them, there is nothingness is declared to be the purest, supreme, best, and unsurpassed of those perceptions, of those samnya, whether they be perceptions of form or of the formless, of unity or diversity. So, this percipient self after death, whether it's of material form or not, and so on and so forth and so on, some people say to reach the state, the meditative state of absolute nothingness, that that's the most supreme, the best, the unsurpassed state of being, the highest kind of state of perception. And the Buddha says, and whether all of that, whether those perceptions are of things with form or things that are formless or unity or diversity, that's all conditioned and gross. but there is the cessation of samskara, the cessation of conditioned habits, the cessation of formations. Having known, there is this. Seeing the escape, the Tathagata has gone beyond that. Okay, so this is why I did not want to rush the sutta tonight. This is so technical, but it's so important. So the Buddha reiterates this matrix of possibilities, right? This matrix of believing or having the view of a self after death that's aware and unimpaired. The Buddha kind of reiterates all of that and says, yeah, those people who say that that's the highest, they're wrong, he's saying basically, because all of that is conditioned and gross. That's the first thing we need to talk about, is how all of that is conditioned and gross. And then we need to talk about, but there is, he says, the cessation of samskara. Okay. So the first thing, when the Buddha says, yeah, all of that way of thinking, it's conditioned. This, of course, is classic Buddhism. This is what definitely one of the main things the Buddha came to tell us about samskrita dharma, conditioned dharma. Quickly, a very quick reminder. When the Buddha is talking about conditioned, conditional, you would probably in the modern way understand it more as he's talking about relativity. The basic idea of conditioned is, and you know me, I'm I'm always using the example of my big cup and my little cup. And the first thing we need to recognize is that a cup all by itself, it's not big or little. It can't be big or little. If you put it next to this one, it is little relative to that one. But if I had a tiny little teacup, which I could find over there somewhere, this would all of a sudden be the big cup. But it used to be the little cup. And that's when we realize, oh, you cannot just have big. Something actually cannot just be big. It always has to be relative to something else, even if it's relative to the perceiver, meaning you're littler than I am, right? Whereas if it was a cup that was 7 feet tall, I would have to admit it's a big cup because it's bigger than me. So the first layer of conditionality is the relativity of characteristics. But then you need to go even further, which is that, is this really a cup all by itself? Or does it need the other, a little liquid inside, a mouth? Does it need something else in order to be a cup in that way? I've given this talk, a Dharma talk, a zillion times, but I just want to refresh your memory that the Buddha is talking about all of these things, whether they be characteristics or what we think something actually is. Like a human, isn't human only relative to other things that are not human? In other words, all by myself, I can't be human or not human in that way. My humanity, my maleness, if I am perceived as male, all these things are relative. From a Buddhist perspective, none of them are fixed. None of them are absolute. They're always shifting and ultimately relative. This leads us to the second part of the Buddhist statement. All of that stuff about the self after death, not only is it all relative or all conditional, it's, quote, gross. And of course, the Buddha's not saying it's icky, not that kind of gross. What he's saying is that if you think that's big, you're only going off of what is obvious, what is like gross in that way, like what's in your face. It is way more subtle, not gross, but subtle. Remember, that's in English, that's the polarity, gross and subtle. It is way more subtle to recognize dependent origination and conditionality. Whereas to just be like, ooh, give me the big one, that is operating on what is at the gross surface level. So that's what, or again, that's my understanding of what the Buddha means by all of those ideas about a self after death. They're all conditional and obviously gross in that way. So that's the first thing the Buddha says. But then in the same breath, same sentence, he says, all of that is conditioned and gross, but there is the cessation of formations. So this is going to be, I guess, maybe our third technical term tonight. This sutra spends a lot of time talking about samskara. Samskara is normally counted as the fourth aggregate. So the fourth aspect of a sentient being, the fourth aspect of a sentient subject is this idea of habituation or being conditioned. And by the way, I do want us to recognize that the word for conditioned that we were just talking about, meaning relative, that word is samskrita. Samskrita. The idea of our habits is called samskara. Very similar words. That's because they are operating on the same ideas. It's actually why the Western idea of behavioral conditioning, B.F. Skinner and all that stuff you learned in sociology class or whatever, the idea of behavioral conditioning, that's the Buddhist idea of samskara. That's the idea of well, we would call it learning, but it's the idea of habits. But what's interesting, if you've never heard this or never thought about it, what's so interesting from a Buddhist perspective is that it's all habits. Even thinking you're you is a habit in that way. So the fourth aggregate, samskara, conditioning or habits, this is a very, very important idea that actually I don't talk enough about. We don't talk enough about it in Dharma doors. The Buddha says, yeah, all of those ideas of self are conditioned and gross, but there is the cessation of samskara. That's what, at least the early Buddhist tradition, that's what the program was all about. Deconditioning the mind or deconditioning the subject. So, in other words, take something like addiction. Buddhism deals a lot with addiction to all kinds of things. But the point is that from a Buddhist point of view, Addiction is a deep habit, a very deep habit where, oh, I'm feeling down. I know what'll cheer me up. And it's a habit to go for that, right? Well, Buddhism has always been about getting rid of those habits so that that's not your go-to thing. That's not the go-to habit. So Buddhism is a program for getting rid of bad habits. But not only that, as I just said a moment ago, and I kind of said it jokingly, even thinking you're you is a habit. And ultimately, early Buddhism especially is about getting rid of all habitual thinking, all of it, so that every thought is like a brand new thought with no reliance on habit or conditioning. Utterly, absolutely responsive to the present moment, like a mirror, is the way they describe it. So, when the Buddha says, yeah, all of that's conditioned, but there is the cessation of formations. I do not like the translation of formations. It comes from the idea of volitional formations, meaning like volitional tendencies would be my translation of that translation, right? But again, I'm a big believer that they are talking about conditioning in that way. All right, questions about either the conditionality of all of that other stuff, or any questions about the cessation, the nirodha of samskara, of habits. All right, so we have then one more thing to go. So the Buddha says the thing about all of that's conditioned, but there is the possibility of getting rid of all habitual patterns. And then he says, having known, quote, there is this, seeing the escape from that, the Tathagata has gone beyond that. So this is our description of what's up with the Buddha, what's up with the Tathagata. And this is saying, of course, that that language that there is this, that's usually Buddhist code language for the Four Noble Truths and for seeing the truth of suffering. So being like, there is this, is at least in an early Buddhist sutra, it's saying, this sucks. There's this suckingness. And seeing the escape from that, the Tathagata's gone beyond all that. Okay. In other words, what the Buddha's teaching, the Dharma here, it goes beyond all of that talk about the self after death. We are not even in the same ball field in that way. Now, the Buddha hasn't explained why that is. The sutra slowly is going to, in a way, reveal what the Buddha kind of is teaching in that way. At this point, he's just saying, I'm not teaching that. I'm not teaching about life after death. But we want to recognize this is the most important thing, perhaps. When the Buddha says, like, yeah, or when the text says that the Buddha, the Tathagata, has gone beyond all of that, it's also saying he's gone beyond the annihilationist view. So he's gone beyond ideas of the self existing after death. He's gone beyond the annihilationist view that the self does not exist after death. And he's gone beyond that weird fifth view of nirvana now. He doesn't claim nirvana now. So, I mean, just to put it very simply, The reason or the way that Buddhism avoids the whole, like, what happens to you after you die? Do you go on or do you just stop? And the Buddha or Buddhism is basically saying, there's no you to begin with. You're confused right now, actually, about it all. So wondering what happens afterwards is really just reinforcing the bad thinking in that way. So yeah, the Buddha has gone beyond all of that. He's not talking about a self after death, but he's not talking about a self that just ends at death either, because he's talking about pulling that little rug out from underneath the whole idea of a self. Versus all the Shramanyas and Brahmanyas that are speculating and holding on to views and asserting views about a self after death that's either percipient or not, and all of that. Okay. Everybody doing okay with that? I know it's a lot of ideas, a lot to think about. Let's do a little more. It'll be review. Like all good sutras, we kind of go over the same ground a few times. So the next section, this is section 5 in this translation, by the way. He says, therein, bhikkhus, those recluses and Brahmins who describe the self as non-percipient, so not aware, and unimpaired after death, they describe such a self that's non-percipient and unimpaired after death. Well, they describe, so option number 2, they describe that self as either being material or immaterial, or both material and non-material, or neither material nor non-material. Since we're talking about a self that's not percipient after death, we do not need to speculate about whether it is percipient of unity or diversity or the limited or immeasurable, because it's just not percipient. So all we're wondering about is that unconscious, I think we could just call it an unconscious self, is that unconscious self after death, is it material, immaterial, both, or neither? The Buddha goes on to say, therein, bhikkhus, these, and I believe he's referring to his argument, his points, but these criticize those recluses and Brahmins who describe the self as percipient and unimpaired after death. And why is that? Well, because those Shramanyas and Brahmanyas, they say that perception, that samya, is a disease. That perception is like a tumor. That perception is like a dart. Whereas they say this, meaning what we're teaching, this is peaceful. This is sublime. This is non-perception. So the group of Shramanyas and Brahmanyas that say that there's no perception after death, it's because they say perception is a bad, terrible thing. So after death, it's kind of blissful, healthy unimpairedness, not tainted by gross perception, basically. So the Buddha says some Shramanyas and Brahmanyas think that about an impercipient self after death. In section 7, though, the Buddha says the Tathagata bhikkhus understands it this way. Those good recluses and Brahmins who describe the self as non-percipient and unimpaired after death describe such a self, non-percipient and unimpaired after death, to be either material, immaterial, both, or neither. That any recluse or Brahmin could say, apart from form, apart from sensation, vedana, apart from samya, perception, apart from samskara, conditioning, I shall describe the coming and going of vijnana, or consciousness. I shall describe its passing away and its rebirth, its growth and increase, and its maturation. That's impossible, says the Buddha. All of that is conditioned and gross, but there is cessation of conditioned habits. And having known, there is this. Seeing the escape from that, the Tathagata has gone beyond all that. All right, we're getting even more technical. So the Buddha, it gets complicated too, because it's where the Buddha is sort of talking the way somebody else would talk. And so it gets a little confusing, but so the recluses and the Brahmins who say that the self is impercipient, is unconscious and unaware after death, the Buddha says that anybody could possibly think that there's a consciousness apart from material form, sensation, perception, and conditioning, the other skandhas, and that somebody could think that they could describe the passing away and rebirth of consciousness, its growth, its increase, and maturation. If somebody that thinks they could talk about just consciousness without talking about the other aggregates, that's impossible, the Buddha says. All of that way of thinking, meaning the self is impercipient and perception's all gross and all of that, the Buddha says, yeah, all of that is conditional. All of that way of thinking is relative and gross. And then we get the repeat of the same idea, that the Buddha, having seen it as it is, goes beyond all that. The relativity or the conditionality that I really want to focus on just for our last few minutes here. I mean, we might do the next section just because it kind of is right in the same breath. But if you understood my big cup, little cup example, if you understand the relativity and the conditionality of these things, then you can go to, in a way, like the deepest levels of this. And it's understanding that the view or the position or thinking in terms of existing I have two cups, an existing one and a non-existing one. This is not unlike big cup, little cup, but this is existing cup and non-existing cup. And I know that you probably think that the quality or the characteristic of existence is an inalienable property of this. But that's like thinking that littleness is an inalienable property of this. It's not over here. The littleness isn't here and the existence isn't here. But guess what? This other cup, the one that doesn't exist, the only reason that you could fathom a non-existing cup is because you have this delusional idea of an existing cup. They're bouncing off of each other just like big cup, little cup. But the idea of existence, non-existence, that's where the scientific mind draws the line and says, no, 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 no. existence is a property of things. But if you're a really good Dharma student, you can see how even existence and non-existence are not inherent qualities. And if you get that, if you really, really get that, then you understand how this is neither big or little and neither existent nor non-existent. That's big, big Buddhist ideas right there. The Madhyamika, the idea of neither existing nor non-existing, but I just showed you how it works. It's about understanding that all characteristics are actually relative. And don't forget this too, by the way. I mentioned it in passing a moment, like maybe a half hour ago. There's one part of this, which is this part, the relativity, which is that this is little because this is big, and this is big because this is little. But there's always another aspect to this. It's this relativity. And meaning that what I see as a little cup, somebody else might see as a big cup. And it's not about some other cup. It's just about the mind that's perceiving it. So take all of that and kind of bundle it all together. But in particular, the way the Buddha escapes all of these speculative views is by avoiding this extreme view of existent or non-existent. Does the self exist after death or does it not exist after death? Which is it? Right? So that's what we're up against. The delusion of existence. Any questions, comments, ideas? Yeah, Noe.
Thank you, Michael. The question of existence or non-existence, which all of this has led me to the idea of then the next part of it is if I have a theistic view of something or a deist view of something that offers me a life after death, in heaven, and that, and this is a quite Western, the monotheistic views, which are, what they are. But yeah, intriguing, intriguing. So, and I appreciate what is said, that, and this is this, and that the Four Noble Truths, tying into the Four Noble Truths. Exactly, this is it. This is the path. It's the middle path, which we come with the, it's the middle path. But I get so caught up in the well, some people believe in life after death. It's in the West, in Christianity and heaven and this, and in Buddhism they talk about heaven and hell, but that's not here and now. Thank you. It's interesting stuff.
Good. I'm glad you're enjoying it, Noe. And a night like tonight, this is heavy stuff. And so we're thinking about, that's the Dharma tonight, is just deep contemplation about these things. And I think one of the main practices, if you will, like one of the main things that we are in a way trying to do, so to speak, is not cling to any of these views. Like, because remember, and this is very subtle, right? But I want you to remember that if you say, that's not true, that's a view. So even, so asserting, no, that's not true, that's a view. So to say that's true is a view, and to say that that's not true is a view. So how would I not hold a view? What I would love everybody to notice is that in the correct Dharma, as they call it, in the true Dharma, there's no room for argumentation. In the real Dharma, there's no room for contest. And I want you to notice that over there in Drishti land, there's plenty of opportunity for contest because it's entirely about right, wrong, true, false, real, not real. That's the recipe for an argument. Whereas if you really are not holding a view, what could somebody say to you, first of all, to get you to argue when you're not clinging to a view? And what would you argue for? And what we would really like to do, I know like the intellectual side might be like, I sense a problem with that somehow, right? It seems dangerous to not believe in something, right? I get it. I get that. But I really want you to think deeply about the world's problems and the argument and the fighting and all of that. And notice what's underneath it, no matter what arena, right? No matter whether it's an intellectual arena or a theater of war or wherever, what's underneath is going to be views in that way. So it just becomes in that way a kind of a practice to notice kind of that rigid clinging to views. And it also becomes a practice to meditate or to think about the value of not doing that in that sense. Maria.
Yeah, thank you. I think, this conversation, this sutra just makes it all the more mind-blowing that anything is happening at all. That, it's like if something's happening, right? So like if it's not existence and it's not existence, well, what the hell is it then? It's unfathomable, right? And then how do we contemplate that? I've been thinking about that a lot lately since we finished Avatamsaka, and it's an oxymoron. How do you contemplate the unfathomable? But maybe that's what Zazen is, I've been thinking. And then tonight, it seems like the sutra is sort of saying that's what the fourth jhana is, getting to that place where it's not exactly contemplation anymore. So, yeah.
Maria, your comment is quite prescient, meaning you're kind of one step ahead of things. And so we don't have time to get there tonight, but I do want to mention something really quickly. Because you said it, I don't want to miss this opportunity. So based on what Maria just said about this sort of, I forget the way you just said it, but you said it really well. In a little bit, so this is not going to be until section 10, but the Buddha's talking about the Shramanyas and Brahmanyas, those other people, right? And it's in the section where he's talking about them that say that the self is right beyond contemplation. That's exactly right. So he's talking about those other recluses and Brahmins, but these are the ones that say the self is neither percipient nor non-percipient after death. And they too describe the self as being either material, immaterial, both or neither, and all of that. And he says, if any recluses or Brahmins describe the entering upon this base, and this is the like the highest base of meditation, the highest state of meditation. So he says, if any recluses or Brahmins describe the entering upon this highest base to come about through a measure of samskara, a measure of formations regarding what has been seen, what has been heard, what has been sensed, what has been cognized. That is declared to be a disaster for entering upon the ultimate base of meditation. For this base, this ultimate base of meditation, it is declared is not to be attained as an attainment with conditioning. This base, it is declared, is to be attained as an attainment with a residue of samskara. It's very technical, but it really echoes what Maria was saying in terms of that the highest state you're never going to get there based on something that you've seen, heard, smelled, taste, taught, thought about. All of that's just words. All of that's just language. You're not going to get it there with that. If anybody says like, oh, stare at this and you'll get to the highest state of meditation, don't listen to them. But interestingly, the Buddha says, what I'm teaching is this attaining that base with a residue of samskara. And this is super technical stuff that we'll get into next week because we're getting ahead of it. But it's this very interesting idea that there's this sort of like a little bit of conditional habit power that you're going to use this little like habit power to get into that meditative state, but you're not going to do it on some new information in that way, something new you've seen or heard or smelled in that way. So again, it was just echoing what Maria was saying about, how do you fathom or contemplate the unfathomable? This was saying that same thing that Maria was saying. You're not going to do it with normal thinking in that way. So, Noe? Ah. All right, everybody. And on that exciting note, let's pause there. I'm glad that we just took our time and kind of made our way through this. I think it was the practice tonight, was just to try to hold all of that, matrix of ideas in mind. So thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it so much as usual.